Hello, welcome to the Field of Screams podcast. Today we are going to be covering the movie Black Phone. This movie was directed by Scott Derrickson. You may know him from the director of Sinister, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, Deliver Us from Evil, Hellraiser, Inferno, or maybe the first Doctor Strange. Derrickson was actually going to direct the second Doctor Strange movie, but he left that project due to creative differences, and then he joined the production for this film. This film was an adaptation of Joe Hill's story, also called The Black Phone. If Joe Hill doesn't sound very familiar, he's actually Stephen King's son. When talking to Joe Hill about using his story and adapting it to a movie, in his story, the killer is actually a clown, but they made the creative decision to switch it from a clown to a magician since it has been so popular. If it was just another clown, it would have felt just like another rehashing of that, or people would have been like, oh, it's just another it. So instead we have a magician. Even though they changed the killer from a clown to a magician, my first time watching this film, I got the vibes that it was a Stephen King story. I didn't know Stephen King's son wrote the original short story, but as I was watching it, I just kind of thought to myself, man, like this feels like a little Stephen King story. Like there's a lot of nice world building, the characters, you root for them, well, most of them, and just a lot of kind of tropes that would be in a Stephen King movie. I mean, the killer has black balloons and he's holding them menacingly. Almost, there's one shot that is very Pennywise like. One of the main characters has a psychic ability, which is sometimes present in a Stephen King story. There's trouble in the household, which is usually a nice little pinpoint for a Stephen King story. Again, I just felt a lot of Stephen King vibes watching this film. And then seeing that his son wrote the short story, I was like, okay, like that, I can see that, I guess. Now in this review, I am going to spoil the movie, so if you haven't seen it, go ahead and pause it and check the movie out. It's a nice, fun little movie, very suspenseful. It's well worth the watch. Let's start this review by talking about the beginning of the film. The beginning of the film does a nice job of laying out the characters and laying us a nice foundation. The beginning scene starts with a baseball game. Our main character, Finney, he's the pitcher, and let me tell you, the first pitch it shows him throw. This kid throws heat. I was like, oh, okay, we got a baseball game, and he throws that pitch in the home plate. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this kid's got an arm. Like, okay, I can't wait to see what this kid can do. Unfortunately, a couple pitches later, Finney gives up a walk-off home run. The player that hit the walk-off home run, he walks up to Finney as they're shaking hands, saying good game, and he goes up to him and says, hey man, you almost had me. Your arm is mint, man. And in my head, like, I played Little League Baseball, and if I gave up a walk-off home run and a player walks up to me and goes, whoa, you almost had me. Your arm's awesome. Like, I'd just say, get away from me, man. Like, don't even talk to me right now. But Finney just nods his head and walks off, because that's who Finney is in this movie. He's a good kid. He never lets his emotions get the best of him. He's just a strong main character. I've never heard kid or anyone really use the word mint to describe a good arm. I think that's just another Stephen King-ism that his son has taken, and it reminds me of the book It, where the kids are like, oh, you bet your fur. I've never heard the expression, you bet your fur, but I mean, when you hear it, it's kind of like, oh, okay, I guess, I know what you mean, but I've never heard that, but okay. So our main character, Finney, he's played by Mason Thames. He has a little sister in this film named Gwen, played by Madeline McGraw. Now, Finney is quiet, kind of shy. His sister is the complete opposite. His sister is a fiery young girl, and she's the one who actually has these psychic dreams. We find this out because one of the kids is kidnapped, and in one of Gwen's dreams, she sees that when the kid was kidnapped, there was black balloons present. Detectives call her in during school and they say, hey, how do you know about these black balloons? Like, do you have inside information? Like, is this being leaked? And her fiery attitude, she goes, what, do you think I'm the grabber? Which that's the name of the kidnapper. She goes, oh yeah, I'm really the grabber, you couple of fart knockers. Which, again, a term I was like, oh, okay. um, I do think this scene kind of does two nice things for the film, though. One, displays Gwen's attitude. She's not afraid of anyone. Finney runs into bullies later on in the film. She tries to help Finney out. She hits one in the head with a rock. She's not afraid to take on anyone. Her attitude leads to a couple of funny moments. There's one moment where she's in her bedroom and she has this little ritual whenever she wants to have a dream or see what happens, and she gets on the ground, she grabs this cross, there's like a little open Bible, and she kind of talks to Jesus. She thinks Jesus gives her these psychic visions. When she isn't getting the visions that she wants later on in the movie, she's sitting there and she goes, well, Jesus, if you're even real, you're not even helping me. I don't even believe in you, Jesus. But then she kind of puts two and two together and she starts to solve this mystery. And while she's riding her bike later in the movie, she goes, oh, Jesus, I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have said you weren't real. And if you could just help me find this one last clue and help me find my brother, I'm sorry, Jesus. I mean, this girl, she's not afraid to talk to anyone. I mean, even when she's talking to God himself, she's kind of just negotiating, like, oh, look, I messed up. Like, can you just help me again? Another useful moment for this scene to where she's talking to these detectives early in the film is when she establishes these dreams tell her what's going on. This leads to the detectives believing her later on in the movie. We don't have to go through that cliche of the psychic girl seeing something, she needs the police help, and then they just kind of sit around and go, well, I don't know, man. Like, this is a little girl. Are we really going to believe in these psychic dreams? We don't have to go through that nonsense once the film is at its climax. The detectives believe her when it's time that they need to believe her. In the movie, it flows a lot better, just for the sake. We have another character named Robin, who is Finney's friend at school. He helps protect Finney from his bullies. These kids that are bullies, they really pick on Finney for no reason. I mean, it's kind of the cliche bullies in the movie. There's more than one, there's a couple. But Robin gives Finney a little speech in the beginning of the movie to where he says, hey, you need to fight for yourself, man. I'm not always going to be here for you. And he tells Finney that he's a strong kid. He just needs to take the first swing sometimes, and he needs to stand up for himself. I wonder what message this film is going to send at the climax of the film. Then we have the dad of Finney and Gwen. When we first meet the dad, he is a piece of work. Finney is sitting at the table eating cereal. He kind of slurps. The dad looks up and goes, can you slurp any louder? And then Gwen goes to do something and knocks something over on the counter. And then the dad just kind of like looks up and she's like, oh, sorry, Dad. And it gives you the impression that it is a pretty rough household and that the father is probably abusive. To back this up, whenever Gwen's called into the office to talk to the detectives also go to the father's work and question him on how Gwen knows about this. So the father, he goes to Gwen, and this is Finney walking into the household, so you kind of get Finney's impression. But the dad is whipping Gwen with a belt, and it is a very hard scene to watch. He's yelling at her, and she's saying, it was my dreams, and he goes, your dreams are just your dreams, and Gwen is crying, and he makes her repeat that her dreams are just dreams, nothing special, and she's crying, Finney's very upset, the dad looks crazy, and by that point you're like, oh, I do not like this dad at all. I feel bad for these kids. As the film goes on, you get some backstory as to why the dad is like how he is. You find out that the mom of the family, she also had these dreams, and the dreams drove her crazy, and it led to her taking her own life. Once you kind of find out that detail, you find out that the dad is just a very damaged man, a man who's in great pain. He drinks a lot, he's kind of just defeated internally. He's very nervous about his daughter's dreams because he's afraid that she's going to end up just like her mother. And he explains this to her. He doesn't want her to go down that path of constantly listening to her dreams and then it leads to her going crazy and taking her own life when she gets older. And he even helps her out as the film goes on. When Finney's missing, he's taking Gwen in a car, kind of driving her around, helping her out a little bit, not over the top. And I think this is important because usually in films, we either get a nice, happy, the standard dad role model that we all would like to be, or we get the abusive father type to where they're just like mean for no reason. Like they're just constantly over the top with how mean they are. The film wants you to know they're abusive. And this dad, in the beginning when you first see him, you're like, oh yeah, like another abusive dad. Then as the film goes, you're like, okay, like I can see why he's kind of a mess. And he doesn't do quite enough to make up for the stuff we see earlier. He's just a very conflicted character, and I think that's interesting. There's some people that were asking questions like, oh, do you think he had enough redemption for his character? And it's like, do we really need redemption, though? Maybe it's just a flawed character. The director, Derrickson, was actually approached to remove the scene of the dad spanking Gwen with a belt. Derrickson said the pushback was only from one person, and there really wasn't any pressure from anyone else. So he just kind of looked at the person and said, well, I know it's an uncomfortable scene, but he's really not even doing anything illegal. So they kept the scene, and even though it's a hard scene to watch, I do think it's a good scene to kind of paint how flawed the dad is. Once we have our characters established, we start to kind of get into the myth of the grabber. There's another kid who was grabbed that went to school with Finney. He was a good friend. The kid who told Finney that his arm was mint, he was kidnapped, never seen again. And there were some other kids that were kidnapped that we don't quite hear about in the beginning of the film, but we come across them later in the film. So Finney's walking home one night, and he comes across the grabber. He doesn't know it's actually the grabber, but there's this van. I think it says abracadabra on the side of it to emphasize he's a magician. But Ethan Hawke, that's who plays the grabber, he stumbles out of his van, kind of blocking Finney off. He drops a bunch of things, and he goes, oh, can you help me? And he kind of gives the pitch, like, if you help me, I can show you a magic trick. And Finney goes up and goes, oh, are those balloons in the back of your van? He goes, yeah, they are. And then he sprays this chemical in Finney's face, which knocks him out, throws him in the back of the van, and takes him to his house and puts him down into the basement, which is like sealed lock and soundproof. Now, the director, Derrickson, he's worked with Ethan Hawke before. In the movie Sinister, he really wanted Ethan Hawke to play a main character. Ethan Hawke had a rule to where he would not play in any horror films. Derrickson talked him down and said, listen, like, why don't you just come out and play in this horror film? And Ethan Hawke responded that he thought that it would put him in a dark place. And Derrickson was like, nah, man, like, when you make scary movies, like, they're actually pretty fun. Like, it's make-believe. Like, just come out and try it. So he talked Hawke into playing the main character in the movie Sinister. But when it came time for this film, he approached Hawke into playing the villain. And Hawke initially said, nah, I don't know. He goes, the script has to be pretty good if I'm going to play this character. I don't want to be known for this scary man for my whole career. So Hawke, he took the script home, he read it, he loved it, and I guess he called Derrickson back, talking in the voice of the grabber. Hawke also said in interviews that he's in his 50s now, and he said maybe his future in acting is playing a villain. So he took the role, and he did a great job with it. To describe what the grabber character is like, the AV Club, they released a statement that Ethan Hawke had a ball playing this role as Pennywise meets Willy Wonka, which I think describes him to a T. One thing that kind of helps the pacing of this film, I think, is when we first meet the grabber, he is very giggly. He's talking to Finney very calmly. He's saying, I won't make you do anything you won't want to do. Finney actually scratches his arm up pretty bad. And the grabber's response is like, well, I guess we're even now. And he's still creepy. It's not like he's an all-natural guy. But as this film goes, it's kind of hard to nail down what exactly this guy wants. What's his plan? I mean, in the back of your head he's a killer. Where did all the other kids that went missing go? But just the way he talks to Finn, he goes, "Oh, no, no, you're fine, man. Like, I'll get you food. Like, it's fine. You don't have to do anything you want." Because it's Ethan Hawke playing the character, you almost kind of trust him a little bit, despite his creepiness. But as the film goes on, you get the details that he's off his rocker and something's not right. The masks that the grabber uses in this film were created by Tom Savini, who's known for his work in Friday the 13th. He's been in countless films, Dawn of the Dead, the original Dawn of the Dead. If you follow practical effects at all, you probably know who Tom Savini is. Once we talk to the grabber and we realize who our kidnapper is and the situation that Finney's in, there's a black phone on the wall, which rings. And when it rings at first, the grabber tells him, like, "Oh, it does that sometimes. I think that's just static electricity." Really a nonsense explanation. But then the grabber walks out. The phone rings again, and when Finney picks it up, it's one of the kids who the grabber has killed. And throughout the movie, these little phone calls, they go a long way. They help Finney kind of overcome being captive in this basement. There's one scene where Finney's asleep on his mattress, and he wakes up, and the grabber's like right there. And the grabber just goes, "Oh, I just wanted to look at you." And then he starts to go upstairs, and he leaves the door unlatched. Finney starts to walk towards the door to go upstairs, but the phone rings again, and it's one of the kids that the grabber's killed, and he's saying, "Don't go up there." He's leaving that door unlatched on purpose, and as soon as you walk upstairs, he's going to beat you. And he said, "The grabber plays this game called Bad Boy. He waits for you to break a rule, and then he'll beat you, and then he'll eventually kill you. So you have to prolong this, and you have to not get him agitated to where he'll beat you and then he'll kill you." So he basically saves Finney right then and there, but while he's talking on the phone, the camera does like this cutaway, or like the camera moves over, and you see Finney facing one direction talking to this dead kid, but then you see this dead kid right behind Finney, and it's actually a really good jump scare. It got me pretty good. I guess this scene was spoiled a little bit in the trailer, but I didn't remember the trailer at all, so I wasn't spoiled by it, but it was a great scene. Each of these phone calls, they kind of give him advice. I mean, besides going upstairs so he doesn't get beaten, but they kind of offer a path of a way he could try to escape. One kid says that a tile's loose in a certain part in the basement. Remove that tile, and then you can dig and try to dig yourself out of the basement. Finney tries that, doesn't work. Then another kid says there's a cord that's loose. You can use that and try to go up to the window and scale up there. And there's this big metal grate that is blocking off the window. He uses that cord to try to get up there, but then the grate comes off. Another kid tells him about a weak spot in the wall, to which he can barrel into and get inside of a freezer. Each of these attempts don't work, but they pay off in the final confrontation between Finney and the grabber. We see images of these kids getting kidnapped through Gwen and her psychic dreams. And in her dreams, it uses this kind of static image. It reminds me of Sinister very much. The scenes to where he's watching the tapes and they're all grainy, and then it's playing that creepy music. It's like that, but without the creepy music in these scenes. And it gives us a little background of the dead boys. It's a nice touch for Gwen's psychic ability to not just be a plot point, but to also give background information. Each attempt to escape, it's suspenseful, but there's one scene in particular that's really suspenseful, to where one of the kids who calls, he was a paper boy who was taken. And the paper boy, the name that he uses, it's actually a reference to a real boy in Iowa who was a paper boy. And he took his dog out to do his route, and both of them ended up missing. The police came across his dog, but the boy was never found again in Iowa. So this character that is basically just a phone call, it's a little reference to a real life event. But when he calls, he tells Finney that the grabber has fallen asleep and the door is still unlatched. He says that he had a lock for his bike that the grabber uses for the front door. And he tells Finney that he wrote the code on the wall. So Finney looks at the code, and he has to go upstairs while the grabber's asleep and try to make his escape because the grabber's going to try to kill him pretty soon. It's really suspenseful because we just see the grabber sitting in his chair without a shirt on, holding a belt, but he nodded off. And it's a very suspenseful scene to where Finney's trying to get the lock undone while the grabber's asleep. By the way, Ethan Hawke is jacked in this film. He must have been really motivated to play a child killer because he is shredded. This attempt doesn't work to get out, and then we get the final phone call from his friend Robin, who tells him to take the black phone, pack it full of dirt, and then he needs to work on his swing, and he needs to get ready for the final fight because the grabber's going to come for him. And then he gives Finney kind of this final message of, I told you need to stand up for yourself. Like, don't let this guy take you like he took me. And you see Finney kind of motivated for when the grabber comes down for the final scene. Now, this final scene, we get the buildup of Finney getting ready. Gwen finally has a dream to where she nails down the exact house that Finney's in. So she alerts the detectives, and she's getting them. They're on their way to the house. The grabber actually has a brother who's very invested in the case of the missing kids. He has maps all over. He doesn't have a job. And he's kind of just clueless as to what's going on inside his own house. Until he goes down into the basement, opens the door, and sees Finney. He starts to get all excited, but the grabber then puts an axe through his head, which leads to our final fight. Finney ends up using the advice of all the other boys. He uses the cord to trip the grabber. The grabber then falls into the hole to which he was trying to dig in the loose tile, which the metal grate was down in that hole, which when the grabber falls down into it, snaps his ankle. So the grabber is immobilized by that little injury. Finney starts taking swings at the grabber. The grabber had this huge dog that was chained up near the stairwell that's barking crazy. So Finney couldn't just run all the way around because if he tried to go upstairs, the dog would get him. And it looks for a second like the grabber's going to win, but Finney knocks off his mask, to which the grabber goes, "Ah!" And then Finney gets one final blow in to take out the grabber. The grabber acting like he can't do anything without his mask was actually a creative decision by Ethan Hawke. And when the grabber's dead, he kind of sinks down into the hole, which again was another decision by Ethan Hawke. At this point, Finney has the grabber dead. He goes to the freezer, to which was one of the boys' advice. He takes out a piece of steak, throws it for the dog to distract him, and he starts to go upstairs. Now, this scene after is great editing. It got me pretty good. So Gwen leaves the cops to the house, and the cops are looking all over the house. You see Finney start to go upstairs, and the cops can't find anything. The house is empty, and then they see the basement door. So then we get like another shot of Finney walking upstairs. You see the cops going up, down here, and they open up the basement door, and there's no one there. And they walk down even more, and you see buried bodies down in the basement. No one left there at all. My initial thought was, oh no, Finney's dead. This sucks. But and then Finney walks upstairs and there's no detectives upstairs. So again, I'm thinking he's dead. Like, this is the afterlife. This is like purgatory. Then Finney walks outside and you see the cops surrounding the house across the street. And then you see Gwen just sitting there, and Gwen looks up and she sees Finney. And she runs across the road. She's the only one who sees him. And I'm like, oh no, he's still dead. Gwen's just seeing him because she's supernatural. And she goes up to him, and I'm waiting for Gwen just to go right through Finney. But she doesn't. She hugs him. And then the cops turn around and go, oh, the house next door, let's go. And they go, and Finney just kind of looks at him and goes, the basement. And they go in, and they go into the basement, and they look at both the houses. It turns out the grabber had two houses that were across the street from each other. He used one house to live in, and he would keep one kid captive in the basement. And then after he killed them, he would take them to the house across the street and bury them in that basement. So that kind of explained that little situation there. Now, one thing I thought, How does one magician afford 2 houses and afford to feed that huge dog and also his brother who does not work a job? But I guess that detail isn't that important in this story. Overall, it was a great film. The pacing was great, characters were great. There were a couple details that they messed up on. For example, in the opening credits, the Wells Fargo Center is shown to be completed, to which in 1978 the Wells Fargo Center wouldn't be completed till a couple years after. Finney has a LED light which wouldn't be available until like the early 2000s. And then at the baseball game it shows a fan with a Coors Light and he kind of pops the tab open, but in 1978 Coors was using a unique 2-hole push-in style opening system for its cans. So just very small details, but I don't think these would ruin a film for anyone. This film was made on a budget of $16 million and made $161 million. So I would definitely say it's a success. There's been talks of a sequel. I don't know how they would go about it since the grabber's dead, but it's sure interesting, and when a studio makes that much money, I think they can't help themselves. Well, I think this completes the review of The Black Phone. If you are sitting here listening, I greatly appreciate it. If you are enjoying these reviews, subscribing always helps. It helps the channel out, so it also helps alert you that a new review's out. So again, feel free to subscribe. Also, feel free to follow Field of Screams podcast on social media. Well guys, until next time.